If you look at the 2000s, India's growth rate significantly accelerated during this decade. I mean, particularly during the period from 2003 to 2007, you had India's GDP growing at an average rate of 9% per year. There were three main factors which contributed to this acceleration. One was the rapid growth of India's services sector, which was mainly driven by a meteoric rise in its exports of software services and information technology enabled services. A second factor was a rapid increase in the rates of investment, which were largely made possible by easy access of the corporate sector to a variety of public resources at relatively low prices, in fact, undervalued prices such as land, minerals, forests, and various spectrum activities for cell phone services. And a third factor was a surge in debt-financed private consumption expenditure on durables, automobiles, and housing, made possible by a rapid expansion of bank credit for financing this kind of consumption, and also by a significant liberalization of capital inflows during the 2000s. Looking at the external aspects of India's growth process, the country has typically tended to import more than it exports, so its external accounts and trade balance have been in persistent deficits. And to finance and sustain these deficits, India has typically relied on its earnings from services exports, on remittances from abroad, and on private capital inflows to maintain these deficits. So to a large extent, this recent rapid economic growth has depended on India's greater integration into the world markets. Coming to the 2008 global economic recession and the way it affected the Indian economy, in the initial years in 2009 and 2010, there wasn't that much of an effect, barring a minor slowdown of the growth process. So instead of rates of 9% and 10%, you had the country growing at 7% or 8%. But more recently, in 2012, there's been a more incipient slowdown in the Indian economy. In the last financial year, India's GDP grew at 6.5%, which, mind you, is high compared to the growth of a lot of other countries. But compared to India's past high growth performance, it does signal a significant deceleration in economic activity. Then the Indian rupee has been on a downward spiral since late 2011. According to official estimates, between November last year and this July, the rupee has depreciated by 20%, which is quite high. Then Indian industry has contracted in recent months, and even the manufacturing sector has barely grown at rates of 0.1 or 0.2% in the last few months. Current account deficits and trade deficits have been widening, and investment has also been declining in the last financial year. Coming to the factors which can help to shed light on this more incipient slowdown in recent times, policymakers have tended to focus on the lagged effects of the 2008 global economic recession, and more recently the onset of an economic recession in Europe as being the primary factors responsible for this recent slowdown. This is true, but if you look at recent reports and studies that have been done on India's recent economic slowdown, these would suggest that there are also other factors involved which have, also contributed to the slowdown. For one, you've had the manufacturing sector becoming more and more dependent on imports, and that has adversely affected domestic manufacturers. Secondly, you've also had a dissipation in the ease with which the corporate sector can access public resources, because of various public protests over the corporate acquisition of these resources for private use. You've also had various corruption scandals involved in the allotment of these resources, and subsequently there have been various rulings by the Supreme Court that seek to monitor the allocation of these resources more closely and the distribution of the benefits from using these resources amongst the affected parties. And besides this, you've also had the banking sector reducing its credit to, finance private consumption expenditure of durables, particularly given that it was an unrestricted expansion of such credit which was responsible both for the economic recession in the United States and more recently in Europe. So these are also some other factors which I feel need to be kept in mind when trying to understand, why the slowdown in recent times has been so much more dramatic. Coming to the challenges that the Indian economy faces, or the human aspects of India's rapid economic growth, one major concern is that this growth process has been almost jobless in character. I mean, the services-led growth path has failed to adequately address the problem of quality employment generation, both relative to India's workforce size, which is more than 450 million, and the fact that a major part of this workforce remains rural and unskilled. There are also reports and studies which suggest that during the years of rapid economic growth, income inequalities and consumption inequalities have significantly increased because this growth process hasn't sufficiently generated quality employment. And even the widening trade and current account deficits are an area of concern because, particularly given the slow economic recovery in the United States and now the onset of an economic recession in Europe, because it's these two regions which account for the main destinations for India's services exports and are also among the main sources of India's remittances from abroad, particularly since the mid-1990s. And now in Europe, there's also talk of the possibility of tighter immigration laws in the future. So this also has the potential to have further lagged effects on India's earnings from remittances. I mean, there's already been some evidence of a slowdown in earnings from services exports and remittances in the wake of these global economic developments. And if the slow recovery and the recession continue, there could be further lagged effects in the future.